Today, we're going to test a Windows NDES SCEP server to make sure it is set up correctly. Okay, so what is SCEP? SCEP, the Simple Certificate Enrollment Protocol. And here's the protocol specification here. Is used to issue certificates with a certificate authority. Basically, it allows devices, computers, to request and receive certificates using this secure protocol. So oftentimes, IT administrators use SCEP for network devices, mobile devices, and basically any device that needs to authenticate itself. And the certificates themselves that get issued are used for things like Wi-Fi authentication, VPN access, encryption, and other uses. So here's one example. A new user gets a laptop, they come into the office, they want to get on the corporate Wi-Fi network. Well, once they log in with the guest network, SCEP can be used to get a certificate which will then authenticate them and automatically connect them to the enterprise Wi-Fi network. So NDES is the Microsoft implementation of the SCEP protocol, and it is part of the Active Directory Certificate Services in the Windows Server, ADCS. So before we start testing, we need to set up a Windows NDES server. So in this video, I'm not going to go through the actual setup. There's numerous guides and videos how to actually set it up. This article will focus on testing the SCEP server to ensure it has the correct setup. This video can also be used to test other SCEP servers. It should translate fairly well. And the reason we're doing this video is because we could not find a good source, a reliable, comprehensive guide to actually testing to make sure the NDES SCEP is set up correctly. And just to summarize at a high level, what needs to be done to configure an NDES SCEP server is basically you have to have a Windows Active Directory server and a domain. Then as a separate server, on a separate server that's part of the domain, you would install Active Directory Certificate Services, ADCS, and then NDES, the Network Device Enrollment Service, is a service of the ADCS. So in our test, we're using Windows Server 2022, but we plan on testing with 2025 as well. Okay, so let's get started. So very first thing we want to do is just to make sure all the URLs that are part of NDES server are working correctly. So here I have another Windows server that's part of the domain, and I want to access two things. I want to access the NDES admin portal, and then I want to access the regular SCEP URL. So the admin portal will be something like this. So we do HTTP, and I know the IP of my NDES server, so I am on the same network that NDES is on. It's a private network, and typically the default will be something like cert CRV and then M SCEP, M for Microsoft, admin, and then it'll ask me to sign in. This is using Windows authentication, so it's a special type of authentication that's specific to Windows. And we enter our username, so it uses a domain here. So I'm going to use my domain here, and then my password. All right, and this is the admin portal. So we have the challenge password, which we can use to request certificate. And in my installation, the challenge password changes every time, 60 minutes in this case, and then gives you a hint. I believe this is the MD5 hash of the CA certificate that should be used as part of the SCEP protocol to encrypt the traffic. And oftentimes the SCEP clients are going to figure this out on their own. So in our case, we're not actually going to use. We don't need to use this thumbprint. Okay, so this is the admin portal. So the other one is the regular portal. So it'll look something like this, same URL. I'm going to copy and paste the URL, but it's going to be different. It's going to be search server mscep and then mscep.dll. And I apologize for the small font here because I'm using a VM. And this other URL is actually going to be used for the SCEP protocol. This web page comes up just to show us that it's working. But this kind of concludes this part of the test. So the URLs, the two URLs, the admin URL and the normal SCEP URLs appear to be working. And of course, if your SCEP server is available publicly, you would use a public IP or public URL here. All right, now we're going to move on to the next part of the test, and that is going to be using a PowerShell script also from this machine. So we've got this machine that's on the same domain. We're going to use the internal network address, and we're going to run a PowerShell script to request a certificate. So what does that PowerShell script look like? Well, here's an example. We specify the URL, the one I mentioned before, the challenge password, which we'll need to update. And then all this other stuff, we're basically building a certificate request here with the proper subject, which includes the common name, challenge password, private key length. And then there's this helper function, helper class, that will actually use the SCEP protocol and format the request for SCEP. All right, so how is this actually going to be done? So on this machine, we simply have this script in a notepad. So that's like the simplest way to do it. We put the proper challenge password here, which we got here. So we copy and paste this challenge password. Okay. And we save this. And then we're going to go to PowerShell and we're just going to run it. This is what our script is called, NDES.ps1, so we're going to run it. And there we go, we got our certificate. So let's go ahead and take a look at the actual NDES server and make sure that the certificate got issued. Here we go, here's our certificates. Let's refresh and we see a certificate got issued. You see this timestamp, effective date 12/32. The current time is 12:42. So the effective date looks like the effective date is like 10 minutes before. So I think it's doing that just to make sure if there's any, if the clocks are off. And then we can look inside the certificate that got issued and we see, test NDES with PS, the correct subject here and the correct key length. Everything's looking good. All right, now at this point, what you can do is you can update the script to use the public URL. But before we do that, I want to show you one gotcha that's related to this URL. Now, it may be possible that you might be trying to just use this mscep URL, and this mscep URL without the mscep.dll, it's not going to work. So let me demonstrate. I'm going to get a new challenge because these are one-time use challenges. So I'm just going to refresh this page, get the new challenge. Let's go back here and let's update it just to make sure. Okay, so basically everything's the same. We got a new challenge and this URL, we dropped the last mscep.dll part. Let's save this. Let's try running this again. And you see, access denied. So without that mscep.dll at the end, this doesn't work. And I'm not quite sure why, but if you do, please share in the comments. So this is just one thing I ran into, is I was using a bad mscep URL, which was a bit frustrating. All right, moving on. Let's test using a public URL. So my public URL, let me believe it's Victor NDES.ngrok.app. And then we're just going to regenerate a new one-time passcode. Copy, paste. Okay. All right. Let's see, using the public URL, if we're going to get a cert. Run this again. All right, we got a certificate. All right, so that is the first real part of the test, that it tests then the server and actually gets a certificate. All right. So in the second part of the test, we're going to use a SCEP client, and I'm actually going to use it on a Mac. So there's multiple SCEP clients out there, but we found that some of them are out of date, haven't been updated, and they don't work with NDES. So we found one that does work, and it is this microMDM SCEP client. And a lot of this code, we're also using it for our own applications, the Fleet MDM server. And then go ahead and follow the installation instructions. I believe it's just as simple as running make client for your OS. And let's see how it looks. All right, so we've already built this here. SCEP client Darwin, so well, I can rebuild it just for completeness. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm going to create a test directory. And the reason I'm creating a test directory is I noticed that this client generates some intermediate files, and we really need to clean those up. Oftentimes, I want to clean those up because if I'm trying different things, the client may end up using these intermediate files instead of the switches that I pass in. I believe it's sort of a bug, or at least a bad UI for the client. So that took me a little while to figure out. All right, so let's go ahead and actually run this. All right, so let's explain this command line. All right, my executable. This is a neat switch they added recently to basically pick the right certificate for encrypting the request. This is our common name. This is the challenge, which we need to update. Let's go ahead and grab a new challenge. I'm doing this off screen, basically the same way I did before. Here we go, new challenge. And then we got our public server URL. Everything's good. Let's run this. All right, and we are successful. You see, throwing this debug switch for additional logging. So you see, it did return 3 certificates, and this switch over here, it just needs to know which of these 3 certificates to use for encryption. I believe it ends up using this one. And then you can see the different SCEP commands. Like you see this get CA cert was sent, then get CA caps, CA capabilities, and all these commands are defined in that the SCEP protocol document. And then we get a success. But this is actually not the end of the story. Just because we got a certificate does not mean it's valid. So one thing I like to do is just to ensure that this certificate matches the private key that was generated. Let's look at the files that were generated. Okay, so this is the certificate we got. This was the CSR, the intermediate file, and this is the private key. So we want to make sure the private key matches the certificate. So we can just run an open SSL command to create a PKCS12 file that includes both the private key and the public key. And when you do that, this command makes sure that those two match. Right? Okay, we know it matches at this point. So that's just an additional test I like to run. Okay. One more thing to note is it's good to, for monitoring or potential debug, to actually see the traffic that's going along to your NDES server. So in our case, we're using ngrok. Let's see. And we can see the traffic that's going across. So you see this last request I did. Let me refresh this. Yeah. You can see the getCA capabilities here that went across. Excuse me. getCA asserts that went across, and then the actual PKI operation to request the certificate. So I found this as a good tool if you really need to dig into the protocol to see why things aren't working. Okay, on to the third and final test is we will actually use an Apple MDM profile to request a certificate from the NDES server. So that means the actual device, the actual OS, in this case Mac OS, will use the SCEP protocol to get a certificate and put it in its keychain, right? So this is like a complete test for basically a real device. So we're going to use the Fleet Device Management MDM server. However, I believe this test will work if you simply create the profile and then manually add it. Let's jump into it. What does this profile look like? This is what the profile looked like, and it is documented, right, in Apple Developer Docs, and there's a similar example here how it should look. Let me point out a couple things here. We have the challenge, so we need to update the challenge, and here's basically our common name, our organizational unit, and here's our URL that we've been using. Really, those are the things you want to fill in the URL, challenge, and your identifying information. So let's grab a new challenge and slot that in here. Okay. And just to show our VM, here's our VM. Here's our VM. We've got the profiles open, the keychain access. So once we save that profile, you could try to just upload it manually, going to system settings, profiles, and just adding it manually. But in this case, we're going to issue it from our MDM server. So we're going to go to our MDM server. We're going to go to our OS settings, and we're going to add the profile, and we're going to choose the profile that we just updated the challenge on. Everything's saved. Okay, everything's good. Let's choose the file. Here it is. SCEP profile. Add profile. And once we add it, basically the MDM server immediately issues this profile to the device. Device is being online, and the device then immediately requests a certificate. And we can see, going to our host, we see that it already got a success because it's in the process of verifying. So that means if we go to our device, we see this cert here, the profile is here, and then the actual certificates are here. So this is the MDM test VM, right, that we issued. It says it's not trusted because this CA certificate is not a root certificate yet. If we want this to be trusted, this needs to be a root certificate, which can be done by either manually adding it or adding it with another profile. And these other two certificates, this is basically a certificate used for self-signing, and this is the certificate that was used for encryption. I believe both of these will get cleaned up but let's just try that. Let's close the keychain and reopen it and see if they've been cleaned up. See, I reopened and those two basically intermediate certificates no longer there. So they're just temporary certificates that are there as part of the SCEP protocol. Okay, so one final thing we want to show is we want to actually see, right, these certificates on our SCEP server, right? Let's just reload so that we can see all these certificates that got issued. So let's just open the last one. And we see that this is our MDM test VM certificate. So yep, everything seems to be working. All right, that's it for today. And I hope you have a good time with your NDES server.